but that didn't really tip me over. The thing that really tipped me over was a much more emotional thing, and it was the treatment of Greece after the failure of their membership of the euro. I mean, Greece was brought into the euro care of basically a fraud. I mean, an American bank helped them dress up their national balance sheet, if you like, effectively conceal their debts. They came into the European Union, and of course, into the euro, and of course they couldn't maintain they weren't competitive enough to maintain the position. And the response of the European Union wasn't to try and help them, maybe by giving them a revaluation, effective de facto revaluation or something like that. It was actually to punish them. And they lost 25. I mean, what's happened to us in COVID is smaller than what happened to Greece in economic terms as a result of the euro failure. And I thought, and you had suicide rates going up, you had infant mortality going up, you had 25% reduction in the consumption of food, you had hospitals being closed, you had tens or even hundreds of thousands of people leaving the country. And I just thought that was brutal cruelty. And frankly, that tipped me over. I thought, this is an organization in which I don't want to be a part, because if it can treat its own, I'd seen it treat Switzerland badly, but if it can treat its own members that way, what happens when we get into trouble? So that was the backdrop.
Interesting.
Very long-winded answer, but
thank you. No, that's a very interesting answer. We often hear the very pact. We want to take back control of our laws, our monies, our borders, and I think it's worth thinking through a little bit more what that meant to you individually. So there you were. If I recall at the time, some people had written your political obituary, but there you were at the most important, development in the country. Some would say since World War II. You were at the center of it. You had been appointed by Theresa May to head up a new department, the Department for Exiting the European Union, and to lead and prepare for the first trade talks that the country had really entered into in decades. Can you give us a sense of what your mindset was then? And I ask you that because you always seemed supremely confident and chipper. And I often wondered at the beginning of these negotiations, what keeps David Davis up at night? It seems like nothing. Can you tell us, what were your expectations? What was your mindset going into those negotiations?
Well, you're right. The answer was nothing kept me up. I mean, only last week, Philip Hammond, who in a way was a sort of bête noire for me in the cabinet. Bear in mind, he's an old protege of mine. Philip Hammond was talking about my attitude in these things. And he said, you could knock 7 bells out of David with an iron bar. And then 10 minutes later, you'll find him in the bar laughing about it. Well, that's what I tried. I mean, as a negotiator, that is almost precisely what I tried to maintain, because we had an interesting negotiation to do. It was the biggest difficulty in the negotiation, in many ways, was not the European Union. It was the schizophrenic nature of the British establishment at that point. You had people who, I mean, the real division in many ways between the so-called Brexiteers and the so-called Remainers was that the Brexiteers were always saying, right, what are the opportunities we can build out of this? Not all of them, but most of them. And the Remainers, most of them were thinking, my God, this is a terrible mistake. How can we minimize the damage? And the truth be told, the Prime Minister was in that second category, really. And she sort of said she was in the first, but really she was a damage limiter. And so you had that backdrop behind you. And we threw away right at the beginning one of the most important negotiating levers. I mean, you may not remember, but before the negotiations started formally, and actually I think it was during the general election, I did an interview on television, and somebody said to me, what are going to be the key issues? And I said, money and timing. And he said, what do you mean timing? I said, well, the sequencing, because the European Union will want to sequence this to suit themselves. That's what they always do in negotiations. None of this was new. And I said, well, the battle of the summer is going to be over sequencing. When we got back after the general election, back to Downing Street, it had been given away. You know, the negotiating team, the Downing Street negotiating team, which basically replied to, as it were, answer the Prime Minister, had given sequencing away. So from that point forward, you know, I knew I had an uphill battle to get us back to a position where we could actually exercise some leverage. And therefore, to come back to your question about always looking smiling and chipper, I thought, well, we just got to be utterly reasonable. We've got to make them look unreasonable by being so reasonable. And that meant you've also got to look confident at the same time.
So just to be clear, you had no idea that they were going to give away on the sequencing, that this was because that came from Downing Street. That was something Theresa May had agreed, and you just had to work with that.
Yeah, basically, yes. Yeah, I'm summarizing it, but yes, basically.
Okay. The sort of optimistic front, you said, well, you know, creativity will dominate, and we will have 27 other nation states who have their own trading interests to advance. And as the future trade negotiations get underway, those interests will be asserted, and we will really get into the negotiations that sort of benefited Britain and played to the UK's strengths. That didn't seem to pan out quite as you and many others thought it would. Were you surprised by the unity that was shown by the EU and the way they approached these negotiations?
No, not really. There were some surprises, but I'll tell you those in a minute. But you may or may not remember that right at the beginning, I also said the first 3 years will matter less than the last 3 weeks, you know. Actually, it turned out to be 4 years, you know, but never mind. The last 3 weeks was right, broadly. In fact, I'm almost surprised it finished a week early because, you know, it finished right about Christmas rather than New Year's Day. And that was always going to be the case. The European Union and the Commission in particular are very good at holding the pack together, always very good at holding the pack together. And they have mechanisms designed for that, and they're well-designed mechanisms for that purpose. And and that's what they did, as we expected. Now, what I had intended to do was not to try and break that up, but to try and understand by direct contact clearly what each one wanted most, so that when we designed our packages the other way around, we were able to create something which was attractive to everybody and didn't hit sore points or red lines for any particular country. That was what we did. Now, bear in mind, there's you've got the interests of the 27, but you've also got the interests of the Commission itself, the institution, if you like, the echo chamber of Brussels. And my God, you know, Brussels is a hall of mirrors and an echo chamber together, you know. And of course, the very federalist instincts of Germany and France in particular, right? And that separate thing sometimes broke down into the so-called punishment agenda. You know, we can't let we can't let Britain be seen to succeed out of this. Now, I knew that would run for a while, and it ran recurrently for a while. But my expectation was this would get tighter and tighter and tighter, and then we would get to a position at the end, which is where Boris eventually got to. Now, what broke that? Two things broke that. One of them was the sequencing. The other one was, it's quite hard to characterize, but let me try. At the beginning, I was always conscious that Northern Ireland with the only land border with Europe for us, with the European Union for us, would be an issue. And I've grown up with I was 18 at the time of the beginning of the Troubles and so on. And what that told me was we're going to have to focus on this. So we talked to the Irish government, and at that time, at the beginning, both the head of the Irish Revenue and Customs and the head of the British Revenue and Customs, these are civil servants I'm talking here, said, there will not be a problem. We will be able to maintain an invisible border just as we do now by using the techniques we use now. And then that changed quite sharply towards the end of 2017. And then one Sunday, again, unbeknownst to me, there's obviously been a conversation. One Sunday, Theresa, the Prime Minister, rang me up at home here on Sunday afternoon in early December. And she said, we have come up with a new form of words on the Irish issue. And I hadn't even known that they were actually engaged. The number 10 were engaged in the negotiations that week. And I said, well, so what are they? And there were a variety of things to argue about. But the key one was, she said, we've agreed full alignment between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland on regulation. And I said to her, well, Theresa, that's contrary to your own speeches on this matter. And she said, well, it only means full alignment of outcomes. Now, for those who are not sort of aficionados of this subject, there's a huge difference between a full alignment of regulations and full alignment of outcomes of regulations. And it's an ideological and a practical difference. Anyway, she said full, and I said, well, have they agreed it's full alignment of outcomes? And she said, and then she switched. She said, David, we have to make progress. And I thought, no, we don't. You know, this is part of the time when we don't have to make progress. Anyway, she said, but I need you to agree with this. So I said, well, let me think about it. And the next day I saw her, and it was the day we went to have lunch with Jean-Claude Juncker and Michel and others. And of course, it caused something of a fuss in Northern Ireland, put it mildly. And we had to go back twice, basically. I went back that day and then back later in the week. And to my amazement, the House of Commons went along with it, indeed welcomed the deal to get us, as it were, over that hurdle to the next stage of negotiations. But that was the point at which the whole pivot of the negotiation turned. Because once you started down that route, you end up inevitably with the withdrawal agreement we had with all of the links to Northern Ireland, which are now causing trouble in the current arrangements. And that's where it started. And from there came the argument about right to diverge, which eventually ended up with me resigning. But that's where the pivot went. It was giving in to the pressure on that when we didn't need to.
And it's very interesting what you've said about Theresa May, and you've also mentioned the Philip Hammond interview, in which he felt that Theresa May didn't really know what she wanted, that her speeches gave mixed impressions to all sides of the Conservative Party. As we know, your party was very divided over what it wanted out of Brexit. What do you think doomed her approach politically? Was it not understanding what she wanted? Was it, what convinced you? Was it that May's approach simply wasn't going to work? Was it that moment where the Northern Ireland issue was not clearly set out?
Well, no, there wasn't an individual moment, at least not in those terms, because that was in December, and we had basically a 6-month battle inside government over this whole question of right to diverge. If you believe in take back control, if that's the fundamental element of this decision, which is, after all, what the Brexiteers all argued. I mean, I had, as you heard, different perspectives on this, but take back control was the key. And there's no point leaving unless you command the basic parts of your own economy, the basic parts of your own foreign policy and all that. Then that's key. So the argument over the so-called right to diverge took place between December and July of the next year. Now, why did this arise then? Well, earlier in 2017, we'd had a general election. And the intention of the general election, because Philip Hammond and I both agreed that it was probably the best thing to do, the intention of the general election was to give her a sufficient majority in Parliament not to have to look behind her all the time
Yeah,
you know,
of
who was
course.
fighting who, right? So it was to increase her power. Precisely what Boris did later successfully. That was what she was trying to do at the time. And in theory, if you believe the polls, we should have won by over 100, you know. But the way she ran the election failed. I mean, I think she would herself admit this. I mean, I like Theresa, and I don't want to be overly critical of her, but she would tell you, I think, that election strategy completely failed. It just didn't work. And she lost what little majority, or she lost most of a majority, basically. So that led to a number of other things. She got rid of her two advisors. That's Nick Timothy and Fiona Hill. All right. Both very, very important to her. They had been her right and left hand through all her time at the Home Office and her time before that. They've been with her, I think, for a decade. And so very important to her. And Timothy in particular was a very strong Brexiteer. He had a very clear idea what he thought it should look like. And so to a very large extent, she rested on that. She rested on what he said and so on. Then she fired them after the election. Many of the party blamed them. I'm not sure, but that's what happened. She fired them, and the result was she then surrounded herself with what you might think of as normal Whitehall apparatchiks. Well, you know, if I went around Whitehall to try to find a permanent secretary who voted for Brexit, I think I'd be looking for a very long time, you know. Of course, there were some civil servants who voted for Brexit, but Whitehall's mindset, its zeitgeist, its fundamental belief was all built around continuing European Union. So she was suddenly surrounded by people. Remember what I said at the beginning about the difference between the opportunity maximizers, who are the Brexiteers, and the risk minimizers, who were the Remainers. And she was surrounded by people who were trying to deliver Brexit, but from a complete risk minimization point of view. And that really made the whole negotiating strategy, as Number 10 Downing Street saw it, very cautious, prone to give away things like the sequencing, prone to give in to the pressure on the Irish border and so on. And that's what happened. And so, you know, I think under other circumstances, Theresa May would have been a very good prime minister. But I think under these circumstances, the sequence of events led to a position where I think Philip Hammond's probably right. She wasn't sure what entirely she wanted out of it. What he said, I mean, I think in the interview, and he said it afterwards to me, he said, and it's something I wasn't really conscious of. He said, if he went to Theresa, she would dismiss everything until she brought me into the room and see whether I could live with it. So I became a sort of litmus test, you know. He actually played back to me. I talked to him after this interview, and he played back. He said, you know, if you said, and typically you'd say something like, "I can make that work," or "Let me take that away and rewrite it. I think I can make it work." Something like that. Then she'd listen. So for a long time, that was the basis of the first year or so, and then after she suddenly surrounded herself with what was, if you like, sort of the old Cameron negotiating team and the standard Remainer civil servants, she lost her direction, I think, to be frank.
Yeah. Okay. Just given the time is passing very quickly, and I wanted to move on to a few other subjects. So let's fast forward a little bit. We have a Brexit deal now. It's what is commonly known and called a hard, Brexit. It may not have quite been the Canada plus you wanted, but it's a deal that is maximalist in terms of the sovereignty and the control that the UK has claimed from it. Now, I guess my question here are twofold. Given your experience with the EU and your deep knowledge of British politics, do you think we are likely to see the deal result in closer relations? Are the problems that we're seeing so far going to be smoothed by the various committees that get together and try to work out the kinks in the deal? Or do you think, as we've seen over the last week with the triggering of Article 16 and then quickly untriggering Article 16, a continuation of pushing on, the bruises of contentiousness. It seems like it could go either way. There are mechanisms within the trade cooperation agreement for closer cooperation or for a lot of contentiousness. And you mentioned Switzerland, a sort of Swiss-style, never-ending negotiation to go on. How do you see things progressing? And if I could also ask you, what opportunities do you see Brexit, now that we have it, providing for young people, for Britain? Where do you see that happen?
Yeah, well, the first thing first. I mean, I actually complained in my brief speech on the treaty, the negotiation outcome, that we actually needed to spend a long time. We, Parliament, had spent a long time actually debating this. We had a day, frankly, but we should spend a long time, because this is not over. It's going to go on for a couple of years at least, as we settle down. And I think, broadly speaking, it will settle down. There will be friction points. There's no doubt about that. But it will settle down. But let me explain why I think it will. From the beginning of this exercise, the arguments about regulation, in a way, have been on a false premise. Everybody sort of assumed, all right, we're going to cancel all the rules that cover the car industry. We're going to cancel all the rules that cover chemical industry. And no, we were never going to do that. We were never going to do that. Indeed, the car industry rules are actually derived from the United Nations, and the European Union has only basically modified them slightly as they go through. What's going to happen is that I think the union is going to realize that what we said, and what I said actually, is that the regulatory changes, if anything, will be just simplifying. They won't change outcomes. We're not going to make cars less safe or food, more hazardous to eat or whatever. We're going to try and simplify those. What we will see, however, is us going different regulatory routes for new industries. Now, we had a sort of stark demonstrator of this with the vaccine episode. Because we weren't in the EMA, we were able effectively to speed up our regulatory process, which knocked a bit of time out of the about a month, I think, out of the process. Now, what I would expect to see, and what I was always been expecting to see, is nothing as fast as that. Nobody forecast that. But in all sorts of new industries, artificial intelligence, genetics, the downstream industries of those, the pharmaceuticals and so on, slow changes in that to actually try and get the best outcome. And that there you might see frictions where they might say, well, we don't want your self-driving cars, or we don't want you. But that's a few years down the road. That's not now. But where we are now, the next couple of years will be a rather gritty sort of sideways movement towards some stability in a couple of years, and that's where we'll be. Now, what about the youngsters? Well, let me take the first thing. The first thing that sort, if I was standing in Warwick now, I mean, Warwick is I think the biggest university in the UK in terms of Erasmus, which we're no longer in, right? And what's going to be quite important, certainly for people like me, is that the replacement scheme, which is supposed to be global rather than European, the Turing scheme, actually works well. At the moment, it's not massively funded, frankly. It probably needs a bit more funding, to be honest. But you can't sort of compare it straightforwardly with Erasmus, because not all of our funding in Erasmus went to our students. Some of it went to the sort of group aspect. So things like that we're going to have to work on. We are going to have to work on. But also out of this will come a completely different national strategy in a whole series of other places. Our approach to research and development has got to be different now. We have already said we're effectively going to double R&D spending in this country. We're going to have to start doing things like building an MIT of the North. We're going to have to start doing things like re-engineering the classroom. There's a whole series of things we've got to do, which are not directly directly sort of written into the Brexit agenda, but they're made necessary by the fact that Brexit has happened. You know, we're in a new world now, and that this was my view before we had coronavirus. Now we've had coronavirus. The shock effect on the entire global economy is going to require us to be quite nimble and quite clever about responding to it. You know, so that's going to be more important for the opportunities of the students who hopefully are listening today.
And David, just to be clear, so your argument here is not that EU membership prevented the UK from doing some of these things, from a more robust research budget, from building an MIT at the North, but leaving provides an impetus and an imperative for doing those things. Is that clear? I mean,
imperative is the right word, I think. Yeah.
Okay. And on the just also to clarify on the vaccine approval, my understanding is that there was nothing about, I mean, being within the EMA would not have prevented the MHRA from approving that vaccine when it did, and from establishing a rolling review. But again, perhaps if I'm understanding your point correctly, that leaving, again, it's a mindset that says we must move. We're on our own. We must move quickly.
I mean, I'm not sure about the truth of the MHRA issue, because the difficulty with these things is people reassert things differently after the event to what they were before. You know, you see it all the time, particularly with rules and regulations. If we'd been still in, the pressure would have been on us to be a part of the whole deal. You know, just not just the EMA, but also the acquisition arrangements, and we would probably have gone along with it. You know, and so we would have been, you know, a few million behind where we are now. So, but nevertheless, you know, you're right as well. The imperative is different where we are now. It also means the other imperatives, which are quite important. The other thing that's going to change about the world economy in the next 20 years, and you can't disentangle economics and politics here, is the status of the West vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis Russia. So America at the moment is the biggest economic and military power in the world. It won't be in 20 years' time, right? It will need to be a moral leader of the rest of the world. In that, the two other biggest English-speaking nations in terms of importance are India and us. So we'll have a role to fulfill there. How does that matter? Well, let me just take one example right now. There's a fair old fight going on in Parliament about the new trade bill, and it's driven by the Chinese behavior over things like Huawei, the Chinese behavior over things like the Uyghurs, over the concentration camps and so on. You know, trade and politics are getting wrapped together again. And what alliances you pick, what stances you take and so on are going to be much more important now. Europe will be, I can tell you now, will be softer than us and the Americans in some of the dealings with Putin, with Putin's Russia and with China. And so we're going to have to make up our own mind, and there will be consequences, because if we fall out with China, as we may from time to time, there will be economic consequences for us. So there's quite a lot of steering, quite a lot of finding our way in this about to come.
Okay, we are now getting some questions through from our audience, and I feel it would be remiss not to give them, put them to you. So let me put a few of these questions to you. So one of them is also one that I thought would be important for you to address. I'm glad somebody has brought it up. How do you respond to claims that Brexit is financially hurting the average British person? So, you know, we know that there is a economic loss to do with Brexit. We know that the red tape, the charges, some of the frictions that have been introduced are not mere teething problems. You know, how do you sort of square that with?
Well, we don't know they're not mere teething problems. We don't know yet. You remember when Zhou Enlai was asked what he thought of the French Revolution? He said it was too soon to tell. You know, well, that is certainly true about some aspects of Brexit right now, and some elements are, well, let me pick an example. There's been on the news. There's obviously pressures at Folkestone, which is causing delays of imports into the UK. Now, there are two reasons for that. And the one which is, in a sense, the most unforgivable is ours. Our government hasn't got the administration right to allow the pieces in. When I was in government, and I don't know what's changed since, we said, right, we're going to just drop the checks on a lot of these things because they're coming from countries which we previously trusted. So if it's coming from Europe, what's changed in Europe to mean we have to check these now when we didn't before? So the government itself has got to get a grip on what it's doing there. In another area, fisheries, say, for example, fisheries is sufficiently small that we should be able to, as it were, buy our way out of that problem. In terms of the longer run, I don't think that there will be an economic penalty for Brexit, so long as we do the sorts of things I've been talking about. But we do have to take a grip of this. Now, coronavirus has made it difficult to do that. But come May, June, when we emerge from this lockdown and we are into a period when we are likely to have concluded in the summer the rest of the vaccination program, we're going to have to do it. And if we do the things I'm talking about, along with economic policies to go with it, which at the moment mean no increases in taxes, it means some deregulatory work, I expect to see the economy grow. The Bank of England today said it'll be back to the level it was before coronavirus and also therefore before Brexit within a year. I think they're probably right, but only if we do it right.
Okay, someone has asked, how is Greece and the Eurozone related to leaving the EU? Any Scottish can find multiple local government issues in the UK. For example, that they disagree with, for example, is that enough?
Sorry, I'm losing you. Say again, sorry. I've got, how is Greece related?
I think the question is, how is Greece and the Eurozone related to the UK leaving the EU? So simply because you have disagreements with the EU, as say Scotland, you have disagreements with the rest of the UK, was that really, was that reason enough for leaving?
Oh yeah, look, the reason I cited Greece wasn't, as I said, wasn't the only one, but the reason I cited Greece was the behavior of the European Commission towards Greece when it was in distress was extraordinary. It's a function of the behavior of the Commission in this context. And just so your listener understands, it was a 25% reduction in the economy. It was a pretty much destruction of the public sector. It was increases in suicide rates. It was massive increases in unemployment. It was increases in infant mortality. It was failing to pay doctors. All of these things because the Commission didn't step back in as it should have done to help them out. To a lesser extent, similar things happened in Italy, in Spain, in Portugal, and in Ireland. It didn't help anybody, frankly, but Greece was actively damaged by European policies, and it's the willingness to do that. It's not the fact it's Greece; it's the willingness to do it that was the problem, from my point of view.
Thank you. So that question also mentioned Scotland, and it made me think about how the arguments for Brexit, how they scan over to the now very pressing debate about Scottish nationalism and where that goes. And we often hear that the 2016 Brexit referendum was won in part because logical arguments simply can't compete with emotional ones. And you could say that the Scottish nationalist argument is an extremely emotive, values-based one. Is there an emotional argument, a values-based argument that you think is compelling that Boris Johnson and the government and your party can make that would hold the union together?
Well, two answers. Number one, yes, I do. I mean, the simple truth is the success of the entire United Kingdom has been dependent on all of us. I mean, we couldn't have done it without the Scots, and they couldn't have done it without us, and indeed the Welsh and the Northern Irish and the Irish, in fact, as well. So that's one part. But the other thing I'd say to you, Therese, is this dismissal of the Brexit argument as an emotional argument, in many ways, I think arises partly because the two sides of the argument talk past each other. It's not actually accurate. Let me give you an extremely gritty example. One of the things that Remainers said about Brexit is, oh, well, you're riding on the emotional argument about immigration. Well, I went to all the red wall seats during the referendum campaign and indeed afterwards in the election. And I remember lots and lots of people talking to me in these terms, but I'll give you one example. The man involved was a painter and decorator from West Yorkshire, right? He was an intelligent man, but he was a working class, sort of upper working class, lower middle class character. And he said, I want to leave. And I said, why? And he said, immigration. And I said, well, don't you like foreigners, And he said, oh, no, he said, if I were a Bulgarian or a Romanian or a Pole, I would be here in Britain too, because they can earn 3 times as much here as they can back home. So I said, so where's the problem? What's wrong with it? He said, Mr. Davies, I haven't had a pay increase for 10 years. Now, that's not it may be an emotional argument, but it's not an irrational argument from his point of view, right? And I think that's very, very important that we recognize that what we think of sometimes as bigotry, or we think of sometimes as an emotional argument, actually has got some substance behind it in terms of his own interest in democracy. Now, come back to Scotland. I mean, I worry. I'll be frank with you. I worry about the future integrity of the kingdom. And indeed, one of the reasons I was fussed about Northern Ireland is I thought it might create a rather bad example for the rest of the kingdom if we've got a separated piece of the kingdom there. But when I go to Scotland reasonably frequently, and I've got a lot of Scots friends. My wife's family comes from Scotland, and they are very rational people about their own interest. And they know that they're going to have to do a calculation about what will happen in the event that they decide to leave in terms of money and so on. And I'll be blunt. The impact for Scotland of leaving Europe, of leaving the United Kingdom, would be pretty difficult financially. That's not for me the biggest argument. The biggest argument for me is a much bigger one about our common culture and our common civilization and the importance of the Scottish Enlightenment in British history and the contributions they make. I make a selfish argument too. I want them to stay because I think they're valuable to us. And I think actually all those arguments get listened to. So I wouldn't jump the gun on what's going to happen either in the Scottish election coming up, or indeed in any referendum that comes afterwards. I think we are perfectly capable of winning that argument. One of the examples that's worth looking at, I think you may even have written about it actually, was Canada. Was it you that wrote? I read an article on it may have been by you, about Canada. I lived in Canada once upon a time for a few years, and Canada went through a really difficult time when the Quebecois were wanting to leave. And there was a huge fear and disruption and so on. And then it settled down. And it settled down partly because they've got a more federal solution than we have. And one thing I think we have to do is to think hard about whether we can develop a federal solution which does a better job than what we have now.
Do you think there should be a 2-part referendum for Scotland, or do you think there's a structure that can avert a sort of one-off vote, or do you think there should be no second referendum, no Indy 2? And somebody has asked, do you believe we're in a constitutional crisis with Brexit highlighting this? So
right. I don't think there should be another referendum soon. I'm at odds with some of my friends. Alex Salmon's one of my friends. I'm at odds with some of my friends on this, but I don't think, because I think it should be. I mean, during the last referendum on Scotland, it was quote, their words, once in a lifetime event. Just like the European referendums were effectively not quite once in a lifetime, once in a generation. Do I think we should do something about the Constitution? Yeah, I think one of the great mistakes that was made by the UK government back when the Scotland Act created devolution was we didn't give them tax raising powers then. I said so at the time. I was the Public Accounts Committee chairman at the time. I said, you are creating you're creating a sort of dependency parliament. This is ridiculous. You know, they're a responsible country. They're going to elect their own parliamentarians. Why can't they raise their own taxes? And Gordon Brown was very poo-pooed it at the time. If we had done that, we might have had a slightly different dynamic now than we have now. Yeah, I would do the same now with respect to federalism. I would look for a more federal solution than we currently have. We've got to learn as a United Kingdom to get ahead of the argument, not to trail behind it. That's the Canadian example. The Canadian example is they got ahead of the argument, and now Canada is a settled state.
That sounds like almost a great way to end it on that positive note. So I think we've gone a little bit over time, and I'm conscious we've taken your time on Friday evening, and that of all the people who've zoomed in. I could talk for a great deal longer. There's so much more to explore on Brexit and many other issues. But thank you for your candor, for being here this evening. Thank you for everyone who came to spend a part of their Friday evening with us. It was very much appreciated. Shall I hand it back to you then?